The mess hall smelled like something the war had almost erased: flour, grease, and coffee. It was the first morning the German women had been allowed to sit unguarded inside the American compound. They lined up along wooden tables, still sticky with varnish, weary from the Atlantic crossing, eyes darting like small birds. The air felt too spacious, the sunlight too friendly to be trusted. At the far end, an American cook, in an iron-stained apron, ladled pale gravy over a tray of split biscuits. The sound it landed with a soft, heavy slap made several of the women flinch before they understood what it was. One of them, a 27-year-old nurse named Liesel, leaned forward and whispered, "Is that porridge?" Her voice held the accent of a continent that hadn't seen white flour for 2 years. The soldier behind the counter grinned, not understanding the question, but reading the eyes hunger mixed with disbelief. "Breakfast, ladies," he said in a drawl that stretched the word like ribbon. He gestured toward the stovetop lined with metal kettles steaming under fluorescent light. The women inched closer. They had been told American captivity would mean harsh rations, punishment for the Luftkrieg, the war from the air. Rumors passed through prisoner transports about cruel guards, humiliation, and starvation. Even the softest among them expected to scrub barracks floors with empty stomachs. Beside them now lay plates filled with a fragrant, creamy substance that smelled faintly of buttered meat. Liesel hesitated, torn between etiquette and need. Her hands, raw from cold Atlantic wind, trembled as she accepted the tray. At first she stared at the food as if it might vanish when the guard looked away. Then she tasted it. For a heartbeat the world shrank to warmth and salt and something foreign that melted on her tongue. It was rich, almost indecently rich. She closed her eyes, swallowed once, then blinked hard to stop tears that made no sense. "It tastes like home," she said softly in German, though it didn't. It tasted like peace, which was stranger. Across the table, another captured auxiliary worker pushed her plate forward timidly toward the cook and asked in broken English, "Are there leftovers?" The question rippled through the hall like a small explosion of nervous laughter. The phrase was awkward, literal. Yet every prisoner understood it instantly. Leftover food, that impossible luxury from another lifetime. The American cook paused, eyes flaring in sympathy. "Plenty," he said, and the bewildered women lowered their heads as though forgiveness had just been served. Through the open windows came the sound of a faraway radio broadcasting swing music. The rhythm felt completely out of place among women who had crossed oceans in defeat, whose last months had been spent in bunkers and blackouts. Yet the music, the smell, and the absurd abundance pressed together into something they couldn't explain. Waiting for cruelty, they found kindness ladled in gravy. In that echoing hall on the first day of their captivity in Louisiana, the simple act of breakfast turned into revelation. The victors did not starve them. The victors fed them like guests. The war had told them America was noisy, mechanical, ruthless. But the gravy was gentle, the biscuits were soft. And for the first time in years, every woman in that hall ate until she was full. The women had arrived only 2 nights earlier, 38 of them, mostly auxiliary nurses, clerks, and communications assistants captured in northern France. Their ocean crossing had been quiet but humiliating. Packed into the lower decks of a converted Liberty ship, guarded by men who barely spoke to them. For 14 days, the sea had been their only rhythm: gray swells, the throb of engines, and the sickly stench of diesel mixing with salt. When they stepped onto the dock at New Orleans, they had to squint at the brightness. The sky glittered blue, wide and far too beautiful for prisoners. Trucks waited, painted olive drab, with U.S. Army stamped on the sides. From there, they had been driven inland to a place none could have located on a map, Camp Ruston, Louisiana. The camp was vast and rural, its fences tracing squares in fields of long grass. Within those wires, the Americans had built a small, functioning town, barracks, laundries, workshops, even a movie projector rigged to a storage shed. For male prisoners, it already housed thousands of Germans, Italians, and a scattering of Japanese sailors. But the female compound, newly built and separated, was quiet enough that birdsong layered over the evening bugle calls. The blitz-scarred women expected austerity, straw mattresses, thin soup, the same gray bread they'd gnawed back home. What they discovered instead bewildered them: order and too much food. The first night, guards offered them steaming plates of stew and potatoes. Many refused to eat, convinced the excess was a cruel joke. "Americans waste," one whispered. "They will make us fat so we can be mocked." The next morning disproved it. Camp routine operated with military ease, reveille at dawn, roll call under the Louisiana sun that steamed the dew off the fields. Work details followed typing in offices, mending torn uniforms, tending a communal garden. They earned small credit slips redeemable for toothbrushes or writing paper at the canteen, a word they learned quickly, savoring its friendliness. Around them, the war continued elsewhere, loud only in rumor and censored newspapers. In Ruston, news arrived in fragments: Normandy, Paris liberated, the Rhine threatened. Yet inside the fence, propaganda no longer mattered. The guards were seldom angry. Discipline came by tone, not blows. Most disorienting was the calm. No bombers droned overhead, no sirens. At night, the compound glowed with electric bulbs that were left on deliberately, so no one woke screaming in darkness. The same current powered the kitchen stoves where breakfast became legend. Biscuits and gravy flour softened in buttered milk, thickened with sausage fat. A Depression-era comfort dish born in America's lean times, now reborn as a feast to hands that shook from hunger. The smell each morning drifted through the barracks like smoke from another world. The women could hardly fathom such abundance. Back home, Germany's cities starved. Flour had turned black from substitutes made of ground beets and acorns. Fats were treasures, sugar a rumor. In their classrooms and training halls, they had been told Americans hoarded luxuries while Europe suffered. At Camp Ruston, they saw something subtler, a nation able to feed even its enemies. One American matron overseeing the kitchen explained through a translator, "You're under our responsibility now. Our prisoners eat well because it keeps the peace." It sounded practical, but the gesture felt deeply human. Plenty replaced punishment. Over the weeks, they learned the rhythms of this strange captivity. The guards played phonographs outside their tents, jazz melodies sliding through humid air. Some prisoners laughed for the first time in years. Others carried shame in silence, unable to reconcile compassion from those they had demonized. When one woman returned to the mess after supper and asked timidly, "Gibt es Rest? Are there leftovers?" The American cook nodded without hesitation. Word spread across the camp that nothing edible was thrown away, not even for prisoners who once wore the eagle and swastika on their sleeves. In Europe, mercy was a rationed thing. In Louisiana, it seemed to flow endlessly, ladled into every bowl. At first, kindness frightened them more than cruelty could have. The German women moved through the days tense with waiting, convinced the generosity was a prelude to humiliation. They had seen too much of war's duplicity to trust ease. When Sergeant Ward, a lanky Southerner with a cigarette perpetually tucked behind one ear, offered seconds at breakfast, no one dared to speak. Only later, when he turned away, did the youngest nurse whisper, almost inaudible, "Can they really mean it?" The biscuits were flaky rounds that crumbled in their hands. The gravy, salty, thick with ground sausage, was unlike anything their palates knew. It shouldn't have existed in wartime, yet here it was, mixing with the aroma of chicory coffee and sizzling bacon. By the third morning, hesitation cracked. Laughter, not nervous but real, broke out at one of the tables when a woman tried to mimic the American accent of another, saying, "More, please." Guards in the corner exchanged amused glances. Routine became familiarity, and familiarity eroded fear. The prisoners noticed that the Americans rarely shouted. Guards joked among themselves, teased one another about baseball, asked questions about Germany's cities they'd only read about in newspapers. The war's edges blurred in those small exchanges. When work details shifted to local canneries under supervision, the women saw even more of America than the compound allowed. Rusted sedans and pickup trucks rumbled past fields where black and white farmhands worked side by side. Churches stood with doors open, hymn music escaping into the streets. The prisoners had been taught that America was decadent, morally weak, ruled by chaos. Instead, they found domestic order built less on submission than cooperation. One evening, after a long day sorting vegetables, an older woman named Irma asked her guard in halting English if prisoners always ate the same food as soldiers. He nodded. That's the rule. She frowned, confused. The rule? In Germany, she thought, kindness could never be written into law. By summer's end, relationships within the camp took on rhythms unthinkable to them at war's start. Younger American guards fetched extra biscuits for the shyest women. Some prisoners helped with laundry for the soldiers. Others taught the cooks to bake German sweetbread on Sundays. Liesel, the nurse who had first tasted the gravy in disbelief, was astonished to be allowed to tend to a sick guard with nothing more than common trust as permission. The shock of gentleness carried its own moral weight. It forced comparison. Every mouthful of rich food recalled the hunger back home, the mothers bartering wedding rings for turnips, the air raids leaving people clawing through rubble for potatoes. One of the prisoners, keeping a small diary on scrap paper, wrote, "We were told the enemy feeds on starvation, yet they spare meat for strangers. I begin to think power may live in grace, not fear." Still, the contradictions were hard to bear. Letters from Germany arrived through the Red Cross censored, but telling enough bombed cities, missing brothers, ration cards that promised nothing. The women read in silence, the smell of biscuits still clinging to their hands. Guilt mingled with gratitude. The taste of comfort became almost unbearable. Sometimes the cooks played jazz records while cleaning up Bing Crosby, Count Basie, the rhythms rolling like an invitation to forget. Curious, the women would stand by the open doors listening. The music sounded reckless and clean, the opposite of the propaganda marches drilled into them for years. A few even swayed to it, then stopped as if caught committing heresy. Sergeant Ward once noticed and winked. "Go ahead," he said. "This music's for everyone." The phrase folded into camp folklore. For everyone. It expressed perfectly what none of them had words for, the absurd decency of a country that gave its enemies breakfast, music, and dignity. As autumn cooled the Louisiana air, the kitchens began serving heartier meals, stews, cornbread, and coffee refills that never ran out. One morning, Irma, who had learned the phrase correctly, offered it to the cook with her thick accent, smiling. "Are there leftovers?" he laughed. "Always." She wrapped 2 biscuits in her handkerchief and said, "For later, for hope." By then, the women had stopped fearing poison in kindness. They saw what the food represented, a self-assured nation whose confidence allowed mercy, a country that fed defectors and captives openly, not as propaganda, but as policy. The realization spread quietly through the barracks, reshaping what they believed about strength, justice, and even womanhood. In a war that had taken everything, a plate of biscuits and gravy had become proof of a bigger surrender, the surrender of ideology to humanity. By winter, Camp Ruston had settled into a rhythm so gentle it almost hid the fact that its fences were lined with barbed wire. The war in Europe was turning against Germany, though news came filtered and late. Inside the Louisiana pines, December brought a different campaign entirely, one fought with patience and food instead of fire. Christmas arrived with the smell of baking. The American cooks, half for morale and half because it felt right, prepared a special meal: turkey, mashed potatoes, biscuits again, and pies that steamed their spice into the frosted windows. The German women decorated their barracks with paper chains made from Red Cross letters and scraps of ration stamps. When the guards entered that morning to check attendance, they found a hand-drawn sign hung above the stove in crooked English letters: "Peace on Earth. Maybe this year." The mess hall filled early. Snow, rare for Louisiana, fell in brief flurries outside before melting into the mud, lending the air a lazy stillness. Sergeant Ward stood behind the serving line in his white apron, pretending not to notice when the prisoners snuck glances at the pie cooling by the window. "Merry Christmas, ladies," he said through a grin. None of them answered right away, but several smiled back. As the meal began, a gramophone played White Christmas, its melody wobbling through scratches. Liesel remembered the first morning in that hall, the shock, the fear of poison, and she felt a heat rise in her throat that had nothing to do with coffee. Around her, the others relaxed into laughter, faint at first, then freer. Guards and civilians alike disappeared into the common comfort of a holiday that belonged to everyone. The biscuits came last, carried in on trays polished to a dull shine. When Ward asked if anyone wanted seconds, an eager chorus answered what had once been an impossible question: "Are there leftovers?" The laughter that followed needed no translation. In that moment, the camp ceased feeling like surrender and became something else entirely: a lesson disguised as hospitality. The women began to see that the Americans' easy abundance was not arrogance, but conviction, that fairness was measured not in victory, but in behavior. Merciful strength was still strength, and America displayed it without speeches. After New Year's, several women volunteered for extra work shifts in the infirmary, tending to coughs and scrapes among guards and prisoners alike. Liesel noticed how quickly compassion crossed the wire once someone dared to start it. An exchange of biscuits at breakfast was usually enough to restore faith in decency for the day. Months later, when the war finally ended, repatriation orders arrived written on pale blue forms. Many wept quietly while packing. The thought of returning to ruins, of walking again through cities where kindness had become rare, frightened them more than captivity had. On their last night, they prepared a supper with the Americans' help: half German, half Southern, rye bread and biscuits, canned peaches, gravy thickened with bacon grease. They sang softly afterward, voices fading in and out of harmony as the guards listened from outside. Before lights out, Sergeant Ward entered, carrying one final tray of biscuits wrapped in clean towels. He set it on the table and said simply, "This is so you remember something good after." No one could find words large enough, so they nodded, eyes wet, clutching the warmth through coarse napkins, as if holding on to evidence that something unbroken still existed in humanity. When the trucks rolled out the next morning, the women looked back through open slats, their hands raised in farewell. Sunlight blazed across the camp towers, the flag, the kitchen roofs. Smoke from the morning stoves curled upward until it disappeared into the enormous southern sky, the same sky that had once terrified them with its size, and now promised a kind of fragile peace. For those leaving, biscuits and gravy would forever taste like contradiction. Humiliation met by compassion, enemy hands offering abundance. Many would tell their children decades later that their first morning in America taught them more about civilization than all their years of lectures and propaganda combined. Because in that place, the victors had shown that mercy could be rationed by choice, and that feeding the defeated was a greater act of power than starving them. When a meal replaces revenge, enemies find their reflection in one another's eyes. And when kindness tastes stronger than ideology, even war begins to lose its appetite.